Martin Van Buren, who was born on December 5, 1782, broke the mold as the first American president not to be born a British subject. His parents, Abraham and Maria, were Dutch, and they raised Martin in Kinderhook, New York. Despite their modest means, the Van Burens owned a tavern, which was frequented by many of the prominent, influential politicians of the day, guys like Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. And this is important because this gives young Martin an early taste and a front row seat to American politics. Growing up in a struggling family with 6 children, Martin's education was advanced for the time. He attended a one-room schoolhouse until the age of 14, and then began clerking for a lawyer while studying law at night. At the age of 21, he'll be admitted to the state bar, and then eventually will return to Kinderhook, where he'll run a successful law practice. Van Buren often found himself defending the common people against landlords, kind of cementing his reputation as a defender of the working class people. In today's episode, we're going to look at the political journey of the 8th President of the United States, Martin Van Buren, culminating in the election of 1836. Let's get started. Van Buren's political journey began with savvy choices. He became a member of the Democratic Republicans, aligning himself with Thomas Jefferson's principles of limited government and individual liberties. And in the turbulent political landscape of early 19th century New York politics, Van Buren will skillfully navigate the different factions to quickly make a name for himself. In 1807, Martin will marry his childhood sweetheart, Hannah Hose. They settled in Hudson, New York, where Martin practiced law, and they had 4 children: Abraham, John, Martin Jr., and Smith. However, in 1819, tragedy will strike the Van Burens when his wife Hannah dies of tuberculosis, leaving Martin a widower with 4 young children. Despite personal tragedies, Van Buren's political career is going to take off. In 1812, he's going to be elected to the New York State Senate, narrowly defeating his Federalist opponent. And this is during the War of 1812 and a lot of political turmoil. And what we find in this period is that Martin Van Buren becomes known as a person who is able to craftily navigate these complexities and align himself with key political figures. The Democratic Republicans were deeply divided, and Van Buren's strategic alliances were crucial to his rise. He led the Bucktails, a faction known for the distinctive bucktail that they wore. And the Bucktails were committed to Jeffersonian ideals and were adamantly opposed to that of DeWitt Clinton, a fellow Democrat. And these battles between Van Buren and Clinton were fierce, but what we see out of this period is Van Buren building a strong political network through these fights. By 1821, Van Buren's political acumen will earn him a seat in the U.S. Senate. Here we're going to see him continue to push for states' rights and limited government, where he'll serve on finance and judiciary committees, contributing to some of the key legislative debates of this period. Van Buren is unwavering in his support for Jeffersonian ideals and wants to unify the party under these principles. Van Buren's political philosophy, however, will be put to the test in the election of 1824, where he will support fellow Democratic Republican William H. Crawford, who was a strong advocate for states' rights, but Crawford loses the election. And if you remember, this election goes to the House of Representatives, where ultimately John Quincy Adams will be selected president of the United States. And Van Buren is very disappointed in this decision because he sees John Quincy Adams as a Federalist in disguise. The election of 1824 was a turning point for Van Buren, who saw the results as a need to build a stronger, more unified political party to counteract the supporters of John Quincy Adams. He's going to begin building a strong coalition around Andrew Jackson, who was a war hero and had strong populist appeal. Van Buren's work is going to lay the groundwork for what would become known as the Democratic Party. In 1828, Van Buren's hard work pays off. Jackson's elected president, and Van Buren's role in this campaign was instrumental. And as a reward for his hard work, Jackson will appoint Van Buren Secretary of State, one of the most prestigious positions in the presidential cabinet. And as Secretary of State, Van Buren will negotiate diplomatic trade agreements, which will expand American commerce. However, Van Buren's time in Jackson's administration was not without conflict. The Petticoat Affair, also known as the Eaton Affair, was a social conflict involving Jackson's Secretary of War's wife. And if you remember from last episode, Van Buren supported the Eatons, aligning himself with Jackson against Calhoun and the other cabinet members. And his loyalty to Jackson during this conflict is going to benefit him down the line. In addition to social scandals, the administration faced significant political battles. Van Buren's role in the Maysville Road veto, which articulated Jackson's opposition to the federally funded internal improvements, was very controversial across the country and in Congress. However, it reflected Van Buren's strong commitment to states' rights and limited government. In 1831, Van Buren is going to orchestrate a dramatic cabinet shakeup by resigning as Secretary of State, allowing Jackson to reorganize his cabinet in such a way that will give him more control over the cabinet. This is known as the kitchen cabinet strategy. And in return for his favor, Van Buren is going to be appointed by Jackson as U.S. Minister to England. However, this appointment is going to be blocked in the Senate by one single vote. And that vote was cast by his political rival and vice president, John C. Calhoun. Despite this setback, Van Buren's political career is going to continue to ascend. In 1832, Van Buren will be added to the ticket with Jackson, and they will be victorious. And Van Buren's time as vice president is going to be consumed with the bank war. As we looked at last episode, the bank war is over the rechartering of the Second National Bank of the United States, and Jackson's veto of this recharter and the subsequent withdrawals from the National Bank into these pet banks is highly controversial and very contentious throughout the nation. And yet, Van Buren stayed loyal to Jackson throughout this crisis. The bank war solidified the divisions between Jackson's supporters and those who opposed it, who will begin to coalesce in what will become known as the Whig Party. These divisions over the bank war, especially, will set the stage for the election of 1836, where the Democratic Party is going to nominate Martin Van Buren as Jackson's chosen successor and Richard M. Johnson of Kentucky as his running mate. Van Buren was a strong proponent of Jacksonian democracy. He opposed the National Bank. He supported Indian removal. He opposed internal improvements. He was a strong proponent of states' rights and limited government. And he viewed his candidacy as a continuation of Jackson's presidency. In fact, many within the Democratic Party will refer to this as Jackson's third term. He represented the strength and continuity of the Democratic Party during this period. The presidential election of 1836 was significant in the sense that this was the start of the second two-party system in our country's political history. The first two-party system was between the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalists dissipate and go away. And then we go through a period of time where it's just the Democratic Republicans. And this marks the start of the second two-party system between the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. Now, the Democrats have already nominated Martin Van Buren, which we just alluded to, and they have added Richard M. Johnson of Kentucky as his running mate. There are four others who are going to vie for the White House in the election of 1836. Three of those are directly tied to the Whig Party. The fourth is loosely tied to the Whigs, but he considers himself more of an anti-Jackson independent. So let's take a look at these candidates a little closer. First up, we have William Henry Harrison, known for being a war hero in the Battle of Tippecanoe in the War of 1812. He also served as governor of Indiana Territory and was a senator in the state of Ohio. William Henry Harrison is a strong supporter of the American system, in particular the internal improvements, focusing on infrastructure improvements, and he opposed Jackson's stance on the National Bank as well. Our second Whig candidate is Hugh Lawson White, a U.S. Senator from the state of Tennessee who had also served as a state judge and in the Tennessee House of Representatives. Initially, White was a supporter of Andrew Jackson's, but broke ties with him because of policy disagreements. White was a Whig candidate who had moderate views, but strongly supported states' rights. He also opposed the National Bank, but was far less extreme than some of his Whig counterparts. White's political views, tended to align with the Southern interests of the party. Our third Whig candidate is Daniel Webster, a prominent lawyer and U.S. Senator from the state of Massachusetts. Webster, who was known for being a tremendous orator, is going to use those skills to speak out in support of the American system, the protective tariffs that come along with it, the support of the national bank, and internal improvements. Naturally, he is going to be in direct opposition to Jackson's economic policies, and throughout Jackson's administration, Webster will be one of the most outspoken critics of these policies. Now, what I want to highlight about Webster's candidacy is how this underscores the ideological differences of the Whig Party. Like, just within the Whig Party, you have so many differing ideological views on how government should be ran. Webster is in support of the American system, strong national government. Where is that going to be supported most? It's going to be supported most in those northern states where they support a strong central government. Our fifth and final candidate is Willie Person Mangum, also known as WP. Mangum was a U.S. Senator from North Carolina and also served in the House of Representatives, and he too once supported Jackson but broke with him over policy issues. He was a strong supporter in internal improvements and the national bank. He was a strong supporter in states' rights and was also very critical of what he perceived to be Jackson's overreach in executive power. The election of 1836 is not just significant in the sense that this was the start of the second two-party system in this country. We also have a major political party intentionally, strategically putting forth multiple candidates for president. More on that in a bit. Van Buren is going to win this election in a landslide. He wins 170 electoral votes to William Henry Harrison's 73. And while this was not a close election, there are three significant things we need to take away from the election of 1836. Number one, this is the last election until 1988, with the election of George H.W. Bush, where we will see an incumbent vice president elevated to the presidency by election, not resignation or death. Additionally, this is the only time we have seen a party intentionally run three, some would argue four, candidates for the presidency. Now, this was strategic in nature. What they were hoping was that if we nominate candidates that are going to resonate with the different regions of the country, we can steal enough votes from the Democratic opponent in those regions that it will prevent him from getting enough electoral votes to become victorious, and then the vote will be thrown to the House of Representatives, where the House will have to decide between competing Whig candidates. That obviously did not work, right? Van Buren won in a landslide, but the strategy in and of itself is an interesting one. Lastly, the third thing we need to take away from the election of 1836 is that this is the first election, and to date the only time, that the vice presidential election was thrown to the Senate. No candidate for vice president received enough votes, so it's thrown to the Senate. And in a vote of 33-16, Richard M. Johnson of Kentucky defeats Francis Granger in the Senate. Interesting stuff. One last point on the election of 1836 is that this is the first election in which the states of Arkansas and Michigan are able to vote, each state receiving 3 electoral votes. In his inaugural address, Martin Van Buren will praise the great presidents of the past and will give a positive assessment of the first half century of statehood. He will, however, address 2 major points of concern for his administration: the rising mob action and abolitionist agitation, both of which he vowed to vote down. However, the Panic of 1837, a severe economic crisis which struck right at the very beginning of Martin Van Buren's time in office, cast a long shadow over his administration. And this depression, which was triggered by a complex web of factors, including the financial policies of his predecessor, Andrew Jackson, and rampant speculative banking practices. Jackson's policies, in particular his war on the bank, played a role in the Panic of 1837. Jackson believed that the national bank wielded too much power over the common man. And so in 1833, he begins diverting that money from the national bank to these state chartered banks, as we call them, pet banks. And these pet banks, who are unregulated, begin printing vast amounts of paper currency without the proper gold and or silver to back it up. The influx of unregulated currency is going to fuel speculative land purchases, which is going to create this real estate bubble. And in order to combat this, President Jackson issues the Specie Circular, which is an executive order requiring all government land purchases to be made in gold or silver. Now, what he's hoping this will do is he's hoping that this will stabilize the economy. Instead, what happens is it causes this contraction in the money supply, creating further destabilization of the economy. When Van Buren assumed the office in 1837, the economy was already on the brink. By May, the bubble burst. And this is going to lead to banks failing because they cannot meet the demands for hard currency. And as these banks begin to close, businesses begin to fail. And as businesses begin to fail, widespread unemployment follows. Food prices plummet. Land prices plummet. And Americans are going to face severe economic hardships throughout the nation. Van Buren, inheriting the dire situation, sought a solution that would prevent future economic crises. His response was the Independent Treasury System, a bold and controversial move aimed at stabilizing the economy by fundamentally altering the way government funds were handled. Instead of depositing federal funds in private banks, which could use them for speculative ventures, the independent treasury would store government money in its own vaults, completely separating it from the banking system. Van Buren proposed this system to Congress in 1837, but it faced strong opposition. Critics argued that it would exacerbate the Depression by withdrawing large amounts of currency from circulation and reducing the availability of credit. The debate over the independent treasury highlighted the deep ideological divisions of this era, with supporters advocating for reduced government interference in the economy and opponents warning of dire consequences. Despite these hurdles, Van Buren stayed persistent with Congress, and after several years of battles over the financial system, the independent treasury will be passed through Congress. And this is going to remain in place with modifications made through the years until the Federal Reserve is created in 1913. And while this does not get us out of the Panic of 1837, it does help stabilize the economy, and it does lead to a more independent financial system. In addition to the economic crisis, Van Buren faced other challenges such as the annexation of Texas. And while many in the country wanted to annex Texas into the Union, there were others who adamantly opposed the annexation. Van Buren was keenly aware of how contentious a decision like this could be. It was fraught with complications. Number one, you had people who were going to create fierce battles over the issue of slavery. Texas is below the 3630 line. That would make it a slave state. And so you have all these northern politicians who are saying, over our dead bodies, is Texas going to be annexed into the Union? But Van Buren was also concerned about complications with Mexico. Mexico still considered Texas their territory. And if you annex Texas in, that could cause a foreign conflict. It could lead us into war. And so what Martin Van Buren essentially does is he kicks the can down the road for future administrations to have to deal with it. Another significant aspect of Van Buren's administration was the continued forced removal of Native Americans, known as the Trail of Tears. This policy, which started under Jackson, is going to be continued, and some might even argue amplified, during Van Buren's administration. The policy called for the forced removal of native tribes in the southeastern portion of the United States and relocate them to west of the Mississippi. These marches were brutal, most notably the Cherokee, who had to march thousands of miles in severe weather and conditions and disease. It's going to lead to the deaths of thousands of native peoples along the way. Van Buren's presidency was marred by economic depression, controversial policies, and national issues that made this a very challenging time. His attempt at stabilizing the economy through the Independent Treasury and his cautious approach to the annexation of Texas demonstrated his ability to navigate the complex political landscape that he was leading in. However, his continuation of the Trail of Tears also show us the moral failings of not only the Democratic Party, but of the country at large. Despite his efforts to continue Jacksonian policies, the Whigs are going to capitalize on what much of the country views as a failed 4 years. The Whigs will nominate William Henry Harrison once again, setting up a rematch in the election of 1840. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.